Welcome, everyone. My name is Blair Topash Caldwell. I'm a citizen of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians, and I'm the Public Humanities Fellow for the Darcy McNichol Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the Newberry Library. Thank you for joining us for today's program, Re-Indigenizing Space in Zhekagoynak, a community conversation event in collaboration with the Chicago Monuments Project, with funding generously provided by Chicago's Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events. The Newberry Library supports and inspires research, teaching, and learning in the humanities. Since our founding in 1887, the Newberry has remained dedicated to deepening our collective understanding of ourselves and the world around us. We connect researchers and visitors with our collection in the Newberry's reading rooms, exhibition galleries, program spaces, classrooms, and online digital resources. The Newberry has recently reopened our doors to readers and visitors. You can visit our website, newberry.org, to make an appointment to do research in the reading rooms. Or you can stop by the library without an appointment Tuesday through Saturday to visit our exhibition halls. Our Rosenberg bookshop is open Wednesday through Saturday. Today's program is one example of the Newberry Library's civic commitment to public education and intellectual engagement, bringing together communities of scholars, students, and the public to discuss ideas that matter in our world today is central to the Newberry's mission. We are also committed to contributing to a better understanding of history in order to promote equality and cross-cultural understanding. It is with that obligation that we would like to begin today's program with a statement about the Newberrys' history and the land on which the city of Chicago resides. Located near the confluence of several waterways, the Newberry Library sits on land that intersects with the Aboriginal homelands of several tribal nations. The Council of Three Fires, the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe nations, the Illinois Confederacy, the Peoria, Kaskaskia nations, and the Miamia, Wea, Chichakwaukee, and Meskwaki nations. The Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Kickapoo, and Mascoutin nations also call the region of Northeast Illinois home. Indigenous people continue to live in this area and celebrate their traditional teachings and lifeways. Today, Chicago is home to one of the largest urban Indigenous communities in the United States, and this land remains an important place for Indigenous peoples. As a Chicago institution, it is the Newberry's responsibility to acknowledge its historical context and build reciprocal relationships with the tribal nations on whose lands we are situated. This becomes especially true in light of the very specific land on which the settler colonial wealth in Chicago has built upon, including cultural institutions like the Newberry Library, several large museums, education institutions, and dozens of high-rises overlooking Lake Michigan, land that was in fact submerged under the lake, used as a treaty boundary, and never ceded by Potawatomi peoples. During this program, please enter questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom, or in the comments section if you are joining us on Facebook or YouTube. As time permits, our speakers will respond to your questions. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Doug Kiel is Assistant Professor of History at Northwestern University. A citizen of the Oneida Nation, he studies Native American history, focusing on the Great Lakes region and 20th century efforts to rebuild Indigenous nations. His current book project is Unsettling Territory, Oneida Indian Resurgence and Anti-Sovereignty Backlash. Kiel has worked in several museums, testified as an expert witness on Indigenous land rights, and in 2008 was an Indigenous Fellow at the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, Switzerland. He currently serves on the advisory committee for the renovation of the Field Museum's exhibition on Native North America. X is an Indigenous futurist, multidisciplinary artist and architect specializing in land, architectural, and new media installation. A citizen of the Coshawta tribe of Louisiana, an Indigenous Chamorro from the island of Guam, his work illuminates the liminal spaces between the ancestral plane and our accelerating post-human world. X is a 3 Arts Award winner, a 2020 New City Top 50 artist, an advisor on the inaugural Chicago Monuments and Memorials Committee, and the first Native American contributor to the Chicago Architectural Biennial. His work is exhibited and collected internationally, including at the Museum of Contemporary Native Art, Ars Electronica, and the MCA Chicago. In 2020, X was commissioned by the US State Department as lead artist of the American Arts Incubator Brazil, for which he traveled to Brazil and conducted workshops, culminating in a virtual reality exhibition, Portal. Madeline Weesaw is manager of the Tribal Placement and Development at Four Winds Casinos, where she focuses on helping tribal citizens obtain meaningful employment and works towards their professional and educational goals. A citizen of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians, she also serves Indigenous and other marginalized communities through her work with the American Indian Movement chapter of Indiana and Kentucky. In addition, she serves on the interim coordinating committee of the Michiana Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. With that, I'll turn things over to X.
Pafde, Chicano, Timalaka, Amayitsa, Fitu, Kasakita, Lenglika, Tautau, Umatadzu, Tautau Islanguahanzu. Hi, I'm X. I'm an Indigenous futurist. I'm a citizen of the Pasati Nation of Louisiana and Indigenous Chamorro from the island of Guam. I'm a member of the Turkey clan. Both of my cultures are matrilineal, matriarchal. So our clans, our lineage, our culture, our art forms are passed down through the women, through my great-grandmother's grandmother's mother, through me onto my daughters. So I'm here as an artist, as an architect, as an Indigenous futurist. And my practice is centered around the centering of Indigenous futurism and Indigenous narratives through the built environment, through different modalities of intervention, of interaction, through different thresholds of experience, poetics, audiovisual, the built environment, and our own reality, our own existence as an interface between history and futurity. So the present tense is the main palette for my practice. The reality of turning radical imagination into something tangible and something built. So through my work, my interests, my trajectory are centered around this understanding of the here and the now, ancestral principles embedded in our present tense, and looking forward towards the future. So works that I have been engaged in the Chicago area to kind of reconstruct these notions of futurity and prosperity in the Indigenous community take the shape of different works. For instance, the Earthworks. This is a big part of my practice currently. This is what you're looking at is a work called Potawatomi, Serpent Twin Mound, which was unveiled in 2019 on Indigenous Peoples Day in Schiller Woods, just outside the city limits of Chicago. The reinvigoration, the reanimation of Indigenous placemaking through the earthwork is something that's been integral to me as a descendant of mound builders from the Southeast Woodlands, and understanding that this lineage of architecture and public art practice transcends the simple augmentation of earth and permeates our history, our culture, the different typologies of earthworks and mounds illustrate, they paint the complexity of our civilizations the beauty and richness of our cultures, predating tribal affiliation, predating colonization. So the idea of bringing this back to a region that is rich with this history, from Minnesota down to the Gulf of Mexico, earthworks, mound building, took the different forms, different shapes. In this particular instance, is the effigy. There are no artifacts inside these works. Instead, we have living, curated digital archives and digital galleries that are experienced and unlocked through augmented reality. That's something that I'm bringing forth with these projects. For instance, the one that's just being unveiled by the Newberrys Foundation called On Earth. You open up your phone and go to these different sites. You go to the sites downtown, go to the Earthworks, and you'll see this living, breathing digital gallery painting the reality of what this place really is. Like, for instance, going to Cloudgate, you see unceded land populating the landscape there. My work lives inside and outside of different institutions, different formats of presentation and intrigue, from a trash can outside the United Center collecting Blackhawks jerseys, to holograms of illustrating stolen artifacts from different archaeological loots throughout the nation, to the earthworks, to infiltrating the Chicago Architecture Biennial and showcasing our architecture, but using invasive grasses to create the hut and burning that inside this colonial structure as a reset for this reconstruction, this reanimation of indigenous placemaking, of indigenous futurity, occupying the city street with what could be a glitch in colonialism, and recentering the indigenous architectural histories and experience here in Chicago. We come from a great lineage of urbanity, of cultural exchange, of beautiful complex societies that we've had to more or less vacate and abandon for our survival. This threshold of survival, I think, is something that we are starting to transition into innovation and prosperity again. We are still here. We don't have to simply survive anymore. We can use the tools that we've acquired through our resilience and start to construct these worlds and these cities again. And that's what I'm banking on. That's what I'm putting all my energies towards, is visualizing what this world would look like if we built our cities again. The majority of us live off of reservations. Majority of us live in city centers. So this idea of urbanity and indigeneity is something that is perpetual, something that's mutually intrinsic. So it's something that I wanted to reinforce, is the fact that we can build our cities again, and we will. My next earthwork will be in the city of Chicago, called the Coiled Serpent, and this was recently more or less fully funded by DKs. So the creation of a new monument, a new memorial within the city of Chicago, centering indigenous voices, centering indigenous practices of architecture here in Chicago, I think is important. And this will be unveiling on Indigenous Peoples Day of this year. So we hope to see you all out there. There'll be a community shaping day for the Indigenous community that have an interest in contributing to this project and helping to realize it. And yeah, that's what I have to say. I think I'll hand it over to Blair and Madeline. Thank you. Awesome too.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Hopefully, yes. All right. Bonjour, Nijana, Madeline Wisa, Indigenous, Michigan, Dodem, Pokaganek, Bodri, Wadamianda, Wazalkik, and Dochbia. Hello, my name is Madeline. I am Pokagan Potawatomi. I'm Turtle Clan, and I come from St. Joseph, Michigan, which is southwestern Michigan. I think it's about an hour drive from Chicago. I am Pokagan Potawatomi. I also do a lot of work with the American Indian Movement chapter of Indiana and Kentucky, as well as the Michiana Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. And obviously today's conversation is kind of centered around monuments and what that means for Indigenous people and the future that we hope to see surrounding the discussion and the presence of monuments in our homelands. And when we speak about monuments, when we have these conversations, I think the most common feedback and question or opposition that I get is that we are attempting to erase history by wanting these monuments removed and Indigenous history taught in its place. But the truth is, if you really look at it, that these monuments, their purpose, what they serve to do is to erase history. And I think that there's kind of a mindset in this country where people, and even in our schools, it's like a huge failure in our school systems, that when we think about history in America, it often starts with contact with colonizers, and anything that you are taught about Indigenous people is, our history as it relates to colonization. And I think there's a huge failure to recognize that there is history in this land prior to colonization. And it's important to understand and to respect and to honor that history and the presence of our people in this place. These monuments and this education, they kind of serve to push this agenda and really this propaganda of America being, the land of the free and the home of the brave. And it really serves to uphold these ideas of white supremacy and settler colonialism as being sort of noble concepts, when in reality, we're neglecting to confront really the hard and horrifying things that happened in this country. And not only that, we're neglecting to recognize and to honor the resilience and the brilliance and the ingenuity of Indigenous people and what we had to do to survive all the things that happened in these lands. And something that I've noticed, it's kind of a strange phenomenon, is that people are kind of really comfortable with upholding the status quo and not wanting to shift the conversation and center Indigenous voices in our homelands. And there's almost sort of a shock when people realize that Indigenous people don't really feel a need or any sense really of loyalty. And we don't feel the need to uphold and to push this agenda of, this being the greatest country on earth. We're not really interested, I guess, in falling in line. And I think one of the reasons that it's so important for Native people to see these monuments removed and to see monuments, like what X was talking about, and having that Indigenous representation, is because when we erase history and when we fail to talk about what happened to this country, really what we're doing is risking history repeating itself. And I think when Indigenous people bring these points up, we're kind of told, and I know a lot of Native people have experienced this and can tell you firsthand what it's like to oppose these ideas and this, watered down, whitewashed version of history that we're being taught. Sometimes we're just flat out called liars, or we're told that we are living in the past, or that we're just sore losers and conquered people. But the thing that's important to understand about Indigenous people is we are not a conquered people. We are not a weak people. We are not an ancient people. We are strong people, and we understand what is good for us and what is good for this land. And so there's really, it's really kind of absurd to me that there's this concept that we're supposed to just kind of fall in line and not say anything. And we're just supposed to make our peace with these monuments. Really what they serve to do is to try and intimidate people of color into not speaking up. But I think when we fail to speak up, what we're doing is we're being complicit in our own oppression and the oppression of others around us. And so a lot of the work that I do myself along with AIM and the MAARPR is to really build that solidarity between all marginalized communities and people who want to be better allies. And, in a little bit, we're going to have a little bit more discussion. And so hopefully we'll be able to talk more about what you, the individual person, can do to be a better ally, and to help educate yourself and to raise awareness to these issues, regardless of your current, education level or activism level or comfort level, really. So I am very honored to be here today and to be speaking with all of you. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what kind of questions you guys have for us. And that's all I have.
Thank you so much, X and Blair. Hi, everyone. I'm Doug. I am your moderator for this evening, playing NPR host, and asking our lovely speakers some questions. And X, I'd like to start with you. I'm wondering if you can provide us a sense of wider context in terms of the kind of work that you're doing. Who are your contemporaries, right? Who do you draw inspiration from? Where do you see this work of re-indigenizing the landscape playing out elsewhere? Perhaps at home in the Pacific or here in North America. But where do you turn to for models?
Sure. Yeah, my contemporaries are my ancestors. The landscape, the residual remnants of architectural presence and power. We look at our land, we look at these cities, and we don't see ourselves reflected, in these contemporary cities and these skylines. Instead, what we see are reminders, constant reminders, monuments, memorials to white supremacy, to occupation, colonization. That's what I see as an Indigenous architect. I don't see, architects like Chris Cornelius or Doug Cardinal celebrated, in the United States, celebrated in Chicago. What I see are regurgitations of fake Europe, regurgitations of expositions dedicated to Columbus. What I see are, everything that is displacing for Indigenous people. And what I draw from, the inspiration that I draw from are, those mounds, those foundations, those cities that were removed to create the L line in Chicago, removed to, put up a building on the south side. That infill, that rubble used to create the unceded land of the Pokagon, where Cloud Gate, where the Art Institute of Chicago, where, Michigan Avenue, Occupy. I use that as fuel for my practice. Non-native land artists like Michael Heitzer creating a huge state park where he created effigies called Effigy Tamuli in the state of Illinois. Upstate from the largest civilization north of Mexico for Indigenous people, Cahokia. These are the things that I draw my energy from. These are my contemporaries, are where we left off. And, it's like putting a puzzle together upside down and you're missing pieces, But the idea is that collectively we can flip those pieces, we can reanimate, reconstruct, and turn these puzzles into three-dimensional experiential worlds that we can prosper in again, and not just have to live within the cages of these colonial constructs.
Thank you so much for that, Max. Really appreciate that answer. Gives us a lot to think about for sure. and I like the idea of picking up where we left off is an important ethic. Madeline, thinking about the drive of our conversation today is about re-indigenizing landscapes, right? Not should we, but how we do, right? And I'm wondering if you can talk to us a bit about your own journey into activism and how you see folks who are maybe new to these kinds of issues, how you see them as being able to potentially contribute in meaningful ways to this bigger movement, locally and elsewhere.
Yeah. So my journey, like my personal journey, obviously, I am an Indigenous woman. I grew up in an Indigenous household, and I was very fortunate to have really strong influences in my life, from my aunties and my grandpa, who always taught me that no matter what, I had to stand up for myself and I had to stand up for other people. So last summer, there was really a huge push for social change and for justice, and there were a lot of movements in general happening. And so I understood that it was my responsibility to myself and to my son and to my community to get involved and to do something. The work that I've done personally started around a Columbus statue in a town called Mishawaka in South Bend, Indiana. And it just kind of grew from there. I was really fortunate that I was able to make connections with people, from the Black Lives Matter movement and the Michiana Alliance and AIM. And to answer the second part of your question, one thing that was really intimidating, I think, and a lot of people experience this when they first get involved in these sorts of movements, is who am I to say anything and how do I even get started? And I think no matter where you're at in your journey, the first step is going to be education. And if you can, try to speak to actual Indigenous people in your communities, because there are over 600 different Indigenous nations in America alone. There's no such thing as like a pan-Indian. We're all different. We all have our own languages and cultures and customs. So figure out whose land is it that you're currently occupying, and learn more about those people. And furthermore, I think we do see a lot of movements for change, and there is a call for progress in America. But no matter what that conversation looks like, no matter what your cause is, it's really important that you center Indigenous people and Indigenous voices in those conversations. Because if you don't, yes, progress is great, but failing to center Indigenous people in our own homelands is just recolonizing us in the name of progress. And so while we might agree with a lot of the principles of the movement overall, it's still really important that we ask ourselves, how is this impacting the Indigenous people who live in this place that I call home?
Thank you, Madeline. I really appreciate that. Actually, going back to one of the questions coming from the audience, and I'd like to encourage folks to be chatty in the Q&A and submit questions that we can dialogue about. But one question that comes for you is if you can tell us a bit more about the significance and meaning of earthworks and mounds, right? And one particular element to flag for those who maybe didn't catch it, right, is the significance of mounds in an ancestral presence in this landscape, right? But also your own community and mound building practices, right, in other parts of North America too. So folks are curious to know a bit more about the practice of earthworks and mound building, and if you could talk a bit more about why that's so significant to the work that you're doing.
Sure. Yeah, mound building is complex. It's beautiful. I mean, look at the architecture of cities. Look at the different typologies of buildings. You have churches, you have banks, you have skyscrapers, you have homes. Look at how complex just the category of building is. That's not too dissimilar from what mound building is. Mounds, for instance, you go to Cahokia, Illinois, right here in this state, right across the river from St. Louis. You stand atop the largest mound behind me here called Monk's Mound, what they call it. And you can look down on the arch of St. Louis. You're looking down, upon the Mississippi River. What these civilizations are reminders of the sustenance, the spine of our people. these waterways, these rivers. The majority of these mound civilizations here on this continent are off of the Mississippi River or off of its tributaries. So the reminder is that, you know, there is a one-to-one relationship with our humanity and our sustenance and the rhythms and ebbs and flows of this earth, constantly in rotation, constantly in flux. Our existence is as finite as the huts on top of these platform mounds behind us. They're complex, they're beautiful. Mounds have different typologies, different purposes, civic use, pragmatic use, you know, situated on floodplains, used in agricultural scenarios, you know, to promote the growth of corn and different types of crops. They're also used for storytelling, you know. Octochinto is a serpent weaving in and out of the earth to remind us of this threshold, this finite trajectory, this notion of post-humanity even. If we deplete our earth and we sever this connection between us and our planet, humanity will cease and there's no sequel for us. The earth will keep spinning. The earth will keep moving. That's the general idea with the use of this serpent symbology, with the use of effigies to tell the story of our clans, the story of our creation and our destruction. You know, mounds have so much significance that they're being reanimated in architectural history of America currently. It's something that's kind of like cutting edge, you know, to Eurocentric, you know, architects occupying this continent. The idea that there are these grand civilizations that existed, predated Columbus, predated Europe's infiltration of our land, and that they, you know, worked like clockwork and they were sustainable. They disappeared without a trace. You know, when resources or when the people that occupied the buildings no longer existed. You know, this idea of finite architecture, the death of architecture. This is something that I want us to superimpose onto monuments. The idea that monuments have, you know, an opening date, but also a death date. The idea that we collectively examine the context and the appropriateness of, you know, different types of interventions in the built environment, including monumentality to white supremacy. Indigenous people have a say, and we can interject and say, this no longer belongs here, or this never did, but this does, and that's the idea.
You know, what I so appreciate about that too is that, you know, the way you put it, you know, in terms of restoring a relationship, right? That you're not talking about just remembering or honoring, right, a past relationship. You know, as we're, you know, thinking about this as, you know, question that begins with monuments, right? Monuments to the past. This isn't about that the way you're describing it, right? I mean, these are, you know, jumping off points for the future instead of markers of the past, the way you're describing it. A question I have for both of you that, you know, you can hopefully help us, you know, think through how to think about, you know, these kinds of wider issues of representation more broadly. And it seems to me there are important questions of different variabilities in terms of what kind of spaces we're talking about. That is to say, public spaces versus private institutions, urban spaces here in the city, potentially thinking also about, you know, communities that are potentially border communities, right, or you know, suburban or, you know, communities in the wider Chicagoland or Potawatomi land, I should say, region. And so I'm wondering if you could, you know, talk to us a bit about how you think that plays a factor, you know, the setting of the particular places that we're talking about, and you know, the institutional climate that surrounds them.
I don't know. Okay, I'll go. Yeah, so I think when we're speaking about like institutions, I guess, or settings, and how that plays a factor into, restoring these relationships and honoring Indigenous presence. I think that it's really important to factor in that no matter where it is that you are, no matter where you're stepping, anytime you walk out of your door, you are on Indigenous land that Indigenous people were oftentimes slaughtered for. And it's really not to make anybody feel bad. We obviously can't turn back the hands of time or anything like that, but it's important to recognize that and to be conscious of that everywhere you are and everything that you do. And, there's a lot of things that you can do personally to kind of be aware of that. And one of the things that, we witnessed at the beginning of this presentation was a land acknowledgement that came from the Newberry and from Blair. But the biggest thing would be research and kind of having that situational awareness of where it is that you're at. I think somebody asked in the Q&A if there was an app or any other resource that you could use to learn about whose land you're on. There is a website, and I believe it's an app in the Apple Store as well. It's called Whose Land. It's free and it's accessible to anyone, and it'll work wherever you're at, whether that's, urban or suburban or wherever. So yeah, that would be, I think, a really great place to start.
X, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, this idea of public, private, this threshold, unceded, ceded, occupied, claimed, reclaimed, all these terms, all these conjugations and declensions of ownership and space. I think it's something that we all need to continually, perpetually sift through, because the bottom line is that we originate. Our origin is in these places. Our origin, are in these sites. Our stories, our life, our sustenance come from these sites that we're displaced from. So the declaration of public space or public park, right, is code for ancestral land for a lot of us Indigenous people. It's code for forced removal. It's code for a severed connection with these places, with these sites. The same goes for reservation. That label. It's a code for concentration camp. It's a code for prison. It's a code for left to die. We have to be cognizant when we talk about this, even in contemporary spaces and contemporary conventions of the built environment. The public domain, the public space, is land that should be for everyone. It's land that should be stewarded by the ancestral people and given and guaranteed to those people that originate from that particular earth, from that particular water and sky. So the public space, the public monument, public art, these are things that I'm constantly suspect of, because the idea and the idea of acknowledgement, talking about monumentality and public space, a lot of these privately owned institutions, even state-owned institutions, are acknowledging people. But acknowledgement should be an action. Acknowledgement should be opening the doors and giving them the keys to the ancestral people back to their land that you're occupying. Acknowledgement should be a welcoming. In every instance, in every scenario, in every email signature, what you should be doing is leaving those doors open for people to return. And the idea of public space should be, and private, is something that we need to really rethink in our definition, with the ancestral peoples, with Indigenous peoples at the forefront of that re-examination.
If I could just
Yeah, go ahead.
Real quick. So just kind of adding on to what he said, as far as like the space and who has a right to be active or present in certain situations or places. I remember when I started first speaking out openly against the Columbus statue in South Bend, and I remember being told that I didn't really have the right to have an opinion or to address council members because I was not officially a citizen of that city. And I think that is extremely harmful to Indigenous people. And that is a perpetuation of the cultural genocide that is still in place against Indigenous people. My people, we have been here since before Columbus ever stepped off of his boat. It is not our burden, it is not our duty, it is not our responsibility to subscribe to settlers' borders and ideas of where we belong and where we don't belong. My people have been here for thousands of years, and we will continue to be here long after whatever this is goes away. So I think to feel as though anyone has any sort of right or ability to tell Indigenous people that their voices don't belong anywhere is, it's harmful. It is violence against Indigenous people, and it's something that we really need to do away with.
I think what's so important too about that is, what you're pointing out is how deep and ongoing ties are, right, to ancestral landscapes, right? It's not a matter of, but you don't live here anymore, right? It's still my ancestral land, right, no matter what. A question that's coming up of interest to folks in the chat is, this vision that both of you are mapping out for a better and an alternative future. How does language fit into that? And
I don't know.
Or perhaps how does language feature in your own work? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, you're fine. I just I didn't want to speak over anyone. Yeah, so I'm actually involved in some other projects right now in Chicago as well. And there's a wonderful woman that I'm working with. Her name is Ji Yun, and she pointed out that whenever you travel to a foreign country, it's kind of the expectation that the polite and the correct thing to do would be to learn the language of that country. You don't expect them to learn your language. There are over, as I've said before, there's like over 600 different Indigenous nations in America alone, not counting Canada and Mexico. So, not realistic to expect us to all learn that many languages. But I think a lot of tribes have resources either online. There are apps. I know Pokagon Band has an app online, as well as there's a site called Mango, where you can learn the Potawatomi language there as well. So, figure out first whose land it is that you occupy, and then just start with like a simple Google search. You could get in touch with the language and culture departments within those tribes. There may be apps available. That information, I think people often don't know where to start, but I think you'd be surprised at how accessible some of this information is, but most of all, how excited Indigenous people get to share our culture and our language. We think it's beautiful. Our language is more than just a spoken word. There's a spirituality that comes along with knowing and speaking your native language. And so if anybody asks, we will share with you very happily. So just don't be afraid to ask.
Yeah, I want to add, language is a monument in itself. Language, the fact that we're speaking in English is a monument to white supremacy, right? I'm here on my ancestral land of Wuhan right now. I'm tuning in from the island of Guam. I'm here learning my language right now with my daughters, and it's important for us as Indigenous people to reclaim and reanimate those monuments in our life that mean the most. Our languages, our architectures, our symbols of what it means to be connected to our culture and thriving. So language is so crucial as a modality, a methodology of intervention. I started creating a land, water, sky acknowledgement film series centered in Chicago, where I'm featuring the languages that lived and breathed in Chicago. Started with Ojibwe. the big seminal film work will be a collaboration with Pokagon Potawatomi, featuring the voices and narrative and perspective, and using my skill set as an art maker to help articulate that vision, that perspective, that ancestral connection to the land. And the idea is to create an unfolding film series that centers Chicago as a point of origin, as a point of trade, a point of cultural exchange, through the different perspectives of the different tribes, with a heightened emphasis on the Pokagon Potawatomi and their ancestral ties. And the idea is to create a template for people to do the same thing in their cities, and their different, places around the world, to center the ancestral people of that place. And this, from time immemorial to time in perpetual, going forward. And it's crucial. Language being one of the very first vocabularies of that land, and there's a lot of embedded understandings tied to the words that were created, on those sites, and it's important for us to go forward, also reanimating the language in order to combat, these worlds that have been constructed around us. For us to break those walls down and to tear those monuments down, the language needs to be reanimated. The connections need to be reinvigorated.
Thanks for that. Another question that's coming up as something of interest in the Q&A is the broader politics of the water protective movements, both earlier in ODAPL, but recently, the threat of pipelines and other threats to natural environment, both in Michigan and Minnesota. Folks are curious, thinking about the built environment, how this fits into a wider idea of what it is to remake the landscape. And, paired alongside that, folks are also hearing about this movement called #LandBack, and are wondering, how these kinds of considerations that you're talking through, right, fit into those kinds of conversations about pipelines and infrastructure, right? And also these bigger questions of land back, though Santiago's been speaking to that already.
Yeah, so when we talk about, and this is always kind of interesting from my perspective, because I think, Indigenous people since the beginning, since 1492, we've kind of warned against the dangers that came with harming, Mother Earth and our water and our air, and that we needed these things to survive, and we need to respect them, and to take care of them. And there was obviously huge opposition and an unwillingness to listen to the knowledge that we had. And so now we're at a point in our history and in our shared experiences where environmental damage, and specifically the harm that's being done to our water, it's getting to the point that it could be, irreversible. And there's all this clear damage and loss of life that is resulting from the harm that's being done to our water and to Mother Earth. And now there's this idea of, well, let's just push it back on the Indigenous people. They'll know how to fix it. Let's put them in charge. And I think that that's really unfair as well, because this is a problem that we warned against. This is a problem that we fought. And now all of a sudden it's being made our problem to fix it, which I think is really unfair, considering all of the other things that Indigenous people face every day and the struggles that we have to just survive, and to make it day to day. And while Indigenous people, we do have a lot of knowledge. We know how to care for the land, and we know how to care for our water, and we are happy to share that knowledge with anybody else who wants to contribute. But I think it is unfair to just expect and demand that from Indigenous people as well, which kind of ties back into the land back movement, or the decolonized movements. These are great movements, and they are important, and they are vital to our survival, but it is not a fight or a victory that Indigenous people can accomplish alone. We need everybody to be contributing to this.
Yeah, I think that's an important point by Madeline. This idea that in the 11th hour, it's our world to save. It's Indigenous people's you know, it's a big ask for us to come in and save the earth, right? After all the atrocities that were, you know, enacted by powers outside of our control. But this idea that you know, we can come out of survival and prosper, but we're still, you know, we're still at this threshold of having to survive in these particular instances. As humanity, you know, on this earth, we start thinking about post-humanity. That comes up so often in my work. This idea of post-humanity, you know, it's something that we actually have to grapple with because of you know, this cornering by capitalism and globalization and colonialism, where we're so removed from our connection to the planet that we have to remind ourselves that we are connected to this planet. You know, we have to remind ourselves that we're human beings in every instance, and that's, you know, for most indigenous peoples, the tribal names for ourselves are human, are, you know, they're different conjugations of this concept. The first people, you know. So this reminder of this framework, this reframing, this recentering of our humanity through our cultures, through our principles, through our spirituality. The world needs this, and it is a big ask for us to be present in the 11th hour. But the idea of land back, also piggybacking off of the, you know, this idea of ravaged land and pipelines tainting water supplies. But land back ultimately is us giving the land back to the earth. You know, it's us understanding that there's this relationship. It's not just us reclaiming and buying up privately, you know, all these properties that are owned and we were displaced from. That's part of it. But the idea is that we ultimately give it back. You know, our existence is finite. We understand that, but this world will keep spinning, and we're trying to heal. Every skyscraper is a scar on this earth. Every skyscraper, you know, leaves a cavity, leaves a scar of equal proportions in the face of this earth, in the body of this earth. It taints our water supplies. This is the understanding that through our built environment, we are introducing scars. If we can shift our thinking to indigenous principles of placemaking, indigenous principles of urbanity, I think we're better off.
Thank you so much for that. You know, I think a great question for us to wrap up with is, you know, looking forward, and, you know, and giving folks also, you know, a sense of hopeful optimism about the work to be done ahead. But folks are curious, you know, who are the Indigenous authors, artists, musicians, filmmakers, right? Are there, you know, particular texts, right? Particular films, comics, you know, what sort of stuff out there, you know, is the material that you turn to, that you feel that folks are leading the way in terms of imagining, you know, a decolonized future, in addition to yourselves, of course, doing that work.
Yeah, so specifically in, you know, Chicagoland, there's an author named John Lowe. He's Pokagon. He wrote a book called Imprints, and that speaks a lot to the unceded land that you've heard us mentioning a lot throughout this evening's discussion. On a broader scale, there are a lot of books written by Indigenous authors. There's one called like The Inconvenient Indian or Red Skin, White Masks. That I've read recently. As far as like mainstream things go, I know TikTok is really popular right now, especially with the younger generation. And there are a lot of Indigenous people out there who are really bringing representation and knowledge. My two favorite, there's one, he goes by the Notorious Cree, and then the other is Modern Warrior. They do a really great job, specifically the latter, talking about what even is a colonizer, what does colonization and decolonization look like. There are a lot of Indigenous artists in the music world as well. There's the Hallucination, formerly known as A Tribe Called Red. Joey Styles is another one that brings awareness to a lot of our issues. So there are a lot of great places to look for modern people who are, sharing this knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I like to add a hallucination as well. It's a Six Nation. They've been a big inspiration for me aesthetically and kind of like, being the soundtrack to a lot of my studio work for so long. There's different arenas, there's so many people with futurity kind of as their trajectory. The idea of animation, but also innovation, in their different fields. Sterling Harjo, has a new series coming out, Reservation Dogs. Who else? Jeffrey Gibson, Choctaw artist based out of New York, is also using mound building as a part of his language. Sky Hopinka, Ho Chunk, filmmaker, also using mounds as a point of discussion and creation. Grace Dillon, coined Indigenous futurisms, but there's so many writers and people that are part of this. It's hard to name everyone because every contemporary Indigenous artist that I know is a futurist. Every Indigenous contemporary architect is a futurist. They're trying to build, trying to reconstruct, trying to create new Indigenous worlds in their different domains, and it's beautiful to see. We're just one of many. There's so many. It's a big movement, and it's something that we all need to push each other to create and to make tangible. And radical imagination is crucial to a point, but the tangible creation of these worlds is what really intrigues me.
And local artists such as Deborah Yepapapan and others are building spaces for advancing these questions, these conversations, I should say, more and more locally here in the city. That brings us to the end of our time. I'll pass it back over to Blair to wrap up. But thank you so much, Madeline and X, for a really great and stimulating conversation. Really appreciate it.
Grudge Bamapi.
Thank you, Doug, X, and Madeline. And thanks to all of you for joining us here today. A recording of this program will be available on the Newberrys YouTube channel in a few days. Newberry programs remain free and open to the public thanks to the generosity of our donors. During this critical time, we need the support of our entire community. Please support the Newberry Library by making a gift today. You can do so online at newberry.org/give. We look forward to welcoming visitors back to events at the Newberry as soon as it is safe to do so. In the meantime, please join us for our next virtual program, Albrecht Dürer and How Art Imagines Our World with Philip Haar and Andrew Rafferty on Thursday, July 8th at 12 p.m. Central. You can register for this and other programs on our website, newberry.org.